yesterday I was in an Uber ride with 4 other people, and we were listening to Dua Lipa so loud that our taxi driver got into it. He was dancing with us, and I kid you not, when we got dropped off, he got out of the car and was dancing around the van. There's people in my neighborhood who started cheering him on. He did a backflip in the street, and it was raining, and he looked at us and said, "Not bad for a 52-year-old."
And then got in his car and just drove off.
I'm not even kidding you. And he was still dancing in his car on the way home. It was the most bananas Uber ride I've ever had. It was so much fun.
Backflip is a pretty advanced move.
Standing, backflip, and then just looked at us. It was hilarious. It was so funny. It was like the most New York, one of the most New York moments. I've had a lot of them. That was a pretty good one. That was up there. Oh man, I'm just remembering it right now, and it was hilarious. Okay, man, we're on a little bit of a budget here, but we got some cool stuff to talk about. Can I ask you a question just while it's fresh?
Yeah.
All right, I was working on a Next app with some folks, and this question kept coming up about how to share state from one page to another. Mm-hmm. So there's this thing where Next gives you pages, this Pages API, right? Mm-hmm. Let's say you're doing a sign-up flow, or like a checkout flow would be a better way to think about it. You're buying like a ticket on, JetBlue, and you go through all these steps, and you're naturally kind of nudged towards like using pages. Mm-hmm. You have like pages, search, and then maybe checkout, and then like address, and then like billing, and then like complete, right?
Yep.
And the user's moving through this thing. And then you start thinking like, well, okay, so what happens is they're building this, and then it's like, how do I get the data from this one page to the next? Mm-hmm. Because like you check out on the form, and then you need to know, maybe the next page needs to know if you like selected a certain amount of seats or something like that.
Yep.
And so basically, long story short, we kind of got to this point where it's like, if you're trying to do that, you might be thinking about it wrong, because if you have a new URL, a new page, and you navigate to it after, you kind of complete step 3, and then you route it out, push step 4. Now you're here. You might have some data that's ephemeral data that's in React, and you're able to render it correctly. But if the user were to like reload the page, it would like break,
Yeah. Well, I think the way I would answer this question for you or for the team you're building it with is, what would you do if this was a Rails app? Right. So let's just like remove React from the equation here. How would you deal with this? Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of gives you the answer where
because it wipes away the client side ephemeral state every time, basically.
Yeah. Well, you might say like, well, I'm going to set up a database, and I have like, step 1 that gets written to a database, step 2 gets written to a database, or in some Rails apps, it might be, well, it's all just ephemeral. It doesn't actually matter until you complete step 5. So I would use, local storage or session storage or something local, persisted locally. And you can do both of these. I guess my point here is like, the reason I'm bringing up Rails is when I think of Next pages, that's actually how I think. That's what I think of when I think of Next pages. I think of like, these are like, how would you handle this in a server rendered app? It's kind of like a boundary. Like I know, of course, you can put like context above in like your app root, but if you find yourself doing that a lot, I kind of think it's like an abuse of pages. Of course, it's totally valid. Like it's totally valid to do that. But if you're doing it a lot,
that's exactly what's happened. And this is not the first time it's run into it. And so we had this discussion about like, when you expose new URLs, you create a page, you're exposing a new entry point into your app. And right now you're only thinking about getting there from clicking continue on step 3. But if you've just added a navigation, entry to the user's browser, they can hit reload, they can hit forward and back, and the state might not be what you want it to be. So you want that page to be derived from the data you load on that page, ideally, so that it can always render correctly. And if it can't, then maybe it shouldn't be a URL, right? But then it's like, so there's like clean answers to all this, but it is funny because there's like, you do get in this weird spot where you are nudged to use pages because they offer benefits and architectural conventions in a Next app. But then it's kind of like what you said, which is like if you do want to share some short-lived state, yeah, you have to put it in _app maybe, which it seems like we don't really do that. And then it's like if you were in Ember or you were in like a Create React app with React Router, you have natural boundaries along the way because of the nested routing where you can have an ancestor for 2 sibling pages that isn't _app. It's kind of like because every URL is siblings in Next because it's designed that way so that it can scale. That's really the idea, is you don't want a dependency of routes that have to all fetch. You want them to be like a one-shot render. They're kind of thinking like e-commerce or whatever. The lowest ancestor between any 2 routes ends up being the app component, and so people can just end up putting stuff in there.
Yeah, I actually think that design, the Next design, is good. I like having that boundary. I think when you're in a React app and you need to like share something between components, you naturally reach for context. But like in this situation, if like you actually do need to share something between multiple pages, I kind of want you to be nudged towards like a database. I know this is at the end of the day, this is like a product decision, but I think if we ever opened a Next app and we were sharing data between multiple pages and we were only using context,
or even like apps, like just set state on like a little higher above.
Yep.
And pass. You're like not thinking about all of the pre-rendering situations, all the vectors that you can get to those pages, and it might just be, I
like
a good point.
I like that the page is an entry point. Like the page is an entry point in the Next app. Page is an entry point in the Rails app. Yeah. So I like thinking about it like that.
Yeah, I do think there are some valid use cases of like master detail style apps, complex video players. Like a Twitch or YouTube, where you have like one player that can maybe follow you around, but you don't want it on every page. And now it's an _app. Like that feels weird to me. It'd be nice if you had a subtree of the app that could have some things at the root. Ember Map's a video player. You might want to put some state above it and then be able to navigate and repaint certain parts of the page and just use something that is appropriate for ephemeral state. And again, context I see as really a way to solve like prop drilling. That's when you should reach for it.
I might put the video like the Twitch is a great example here because it's definitely ephemeral, right? I might make a context for that. It's like a global thing.
Yeah, but you would want it to be a context in this subtree. Let's say that Twitch has like browse, channels, whatever, and that's like a third of the app. And you have other 2/3 of the app where there's no video player.
You don't want it to, you're saying you don't want it to follow me to like the about page or like the account management page. If I'm on the account management
the entire
page.
Other section of the site. Yeah. So but it's a trade-off, but yeah, it's
a good point because in like React Router, you get to do all those trees, lay them out yourself.
Exactly. Cool. Just kind of wanted to make sure we were like on the same page about that. But I do think that that's something that I've been discussing a lot recently with multiple teams. So I think it's something that there could be some good education on about where should I put this state? How should I think about this? When you make a new page, you're adding a new entry point to your app. Whoops. Let me just fix my camera. Okay, I'm just kicking my camera. That's fine. You're adding a new entry point to your page, so you should really. There's a lot more to consider that than just what it might first seem like.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. What do you want to talk about next? Do you want to talk about principles.dev or suspense stuff? How about suspense stuff?
Yeah, let's dig in.
Okay. Shake it off. Now we're getting into the good stuff. So as I've been playing around with suspense and following some of the rabbit holes, and I say that because it's still early days, React 18 I've been playing with, it's an alpha. Suspense has been in development for years now and it's changed a lot. But obviously because 18 alpha did come out recently, it seems like there's getting closer to some stability around the APIs there. Been reading like RFCs and like going back through some of the old blog posts and stuff, just trying to get a grasp of everything. I was working on my fitness app with Suspense, trying to get this fading loader to work. And what I learned through some of my research is basically that the use case I'm using Suspense for, which is data fetching, is different than the current documented use case for the public documented stable use case for Suspense, which at the moment is basically only React.lazy, which is to lazily import components in your React app and be able to use Suspense to provide a fallback UI for it. So that's like really solving a code splitting case. But most of the talks around Suspense are around data fetching. Even the library I'm using, SWR, has like an option for Suspense is true. So it's like, oh, we can use data fetching with Suspense. Well, it turns out there are some of the last bits and pieces of this that are kind of still under research and development. And it's different enough that it's not complete yet, you know? And if you watch some of the talks from ReactConf, I think when Dan Abramov first went over it, he had this cache writer thing that he was showing off when he was showing off potential future APIs of using Suspense with data fetching. And that turns out to be a pretty critical part, the cache itself, in order to use Suspense for data fetching. So I'll link to some of the stuff I've been reading. It's pretty interesting. But yeah, that's some of what I've been learning.
Why? So, like, why doesn't it work for data fetching? It feels like you data fetch with promises. In Suspense, you can throw promises. Like, why doesn't it? Where'd your app break?
Yeah. There was a way that SWR was breaking with Suspense in React 18, and it has to do with this cache invalidation part. And so basically when I started experimenting with Suspense, I was like throwing new promise in render and then resolving it, and then React would re-render it, and now it has the data. That's kind of a very simplistic high-level view of how it works, right? And that does kind of work, but it turns out it only happens to work, and there's some ways it could fail. The actual contract of Suspense is like very specific. And maybe I'm actually going to just pull it up while I'm talking, because there's a cool RFC where they're talking about this. But first of all, there's little things like the promise that you throw. This is really cool too, because it's kind of mind-blowing, this stuff. And we had some conversations this week, but like a lot of the stuff starts falling into place. Even when you think about how, you know how in React, if you use state and you pass in like an object, and like when you re-render it, if the object gets recreated, like it's a new value. And whereas if you like use state and you pass in the string ABC, that's like the same thing. Mm-hmm. So if you call like set state and you pass in the same string, React won't re-render your component, because it's the same from the JavaScript language perspective. It's the same identity. Whereas if you called set state and pass in a new object, it wouldn't be. And that comes up as you become more comfortable and familiar with React and work with it more. You kind of realize you have to have this notion of identity in JavaScript. And it turns out to be a really crucial idea, because if a function is recreated on render and it passes it down, you're going to get in a situation where you're re-rendering things and you shouldn't be. And it's not about performance. It's about correctness, right?
Yep.
It's about a function that gets recreated and maybe closes over an old value, right? We have stale closure problems in React, especially with hooks and function components. So you end up learning about these things. And it's kind of like this whole paradigm is about nudging you towards you acquire a better grasp of identity, so that you really internalize like UI as a function of state very deeply, so that you write your app code so that it can work like that over and over again. So that given us a state, you do get a rendering of your app at a particular point in time for a particular set of state values, and it's going to be consistent. And this turns out to be like so important for like everything that they're doing with all of this concurrent mode and async rendering stuff.
Mm-hmm. You know, the function, just to like interject here, the function closing over state is actually a great example of that, because if you have a function that references, like a function on an object that references like this dot first name, and you pass that function around your app, well, if this dot first name ever changes, your function isn't consistent with state. Like your function is consistent with like the most recent render of that object, but it's not like consistent with like, you know, at state at X time. But when it closes over stale values, or when it closes over values, it's now consistent for that, like for that data, this function is now consistent. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Definitely. And it's actually,
it's a good thing. It's, by the way, it's a really good thing.
Well, it's there's trade-offs, right? Because when we started learning React, especially coming from Ember, which uses objects as a natural place to co-locate data and actions, basically, and you have these kind of, an object is a stable reference that you get, and so the this dot properties can change even while the this stays the same. It's why like const user equals object first name, and just like, oh, it's const, it's immutable, but then like you can do user dot first name as something else, right? So it's not. So it's almost like React doesn't use this, right? In like idiomatic React code, you're not going to see this anywhere.
Yep.
And you might first learn React and be like, oh, this is like so easy though. It's a stable thing. I need this to be stable for X reasons. And now I'm confronted early on with having to understand like stability and object identity at a deeper level. And maybe even adding more code or more explicit code or just more code in certain places to do the kind of thing that you wouldn't have to do if you could just use this reference.
That's fair. I guess if you like inside the render of your component, if you defined a function called like full name, and it just returns, you know, first name and last name, from your mental model, you're like, oh, I only have one full name function. But you know, eventually you realize, no, you actually have n full name functions, one for every render. You're just seeing the most recent one on the screen right now.
Yeah,
but yes,
exactly. So it's a hurdle. It's I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's harder, especially in the beginning, but it's getting you to think about, you know, one of Dan's posts on his Overreacted blog talks about how functions are part of the data flow. And he's saying, here's how to write good components, never stop the data flow. And it's the simple idea that you kind of learn right at the beginning, which is like when a prop changes, your UI should change, right? JSX does that for inner HTML. Like if you do curly, you know, message and message changes, then the inner HTML will change. That's like the bread and butter, what all the UI frameworks do for you. But then as you write your own abstractions, you need to make sure you're doing the same thing. And so you could do a full name function and it would kind of work, but then you realize like it's changing each time. And what if it closes over, references something else, and you add something asynchronous? Now you realize that you are interrupting the data flow maybe, and you haven't thought about how it should behave when something changes. So when you're thinking about it more explicitly and you're like, oh, this function is actually part of the data flow, what if they change, you know, his example was set interval where they change the callback and it needs to like re-sync itself. And it's not the kind of thing you would normally think of if you just threw like a set timeout in there, but it's actually part of the data flow. So that's why the hook version ends up being more like reactive in a sense. And again, with the suspense stuff, it's all about like being able to understand that your app is in these different states. At any given time, you have a tree of components rendered, and you want these trees to always be consistent. Now, what gets really interesting is with the new stuff and Suspense in particular, and I guess this whole blanket of like async React or async rendering, is that this is so important because you can now, with Suspense, React can have multiple versions of your app, different trees that represent different versions of your UI in different like potentialities, and based on something that could happen in the future, based on something like how much CPU is available to it, based on something like how slow the network is. And React, if you've coded your app in the correct way, can make all these different trees representing these different things kind of in parallel before committing them to the screen. But it actually has a queue of these things and then can decide when and how to use them. But as soon as you think about that, you're like, oh, it's very important that all of these trees are consistent with a given world that they might be in. And that is exactly why all of these things like identity are so important.
Mm-hmm. Can you give an example of consistency and all these parallel trees, like a real world example of one?
Yeah. So I think the simple one that I've been learning with Suspense is like the data fetching thing, where before Suspense, React renders a component and it's a function and it's only sync and there's only one way to do it basically. So you render the component and you get the output value. And so if you make a query request, you need to run the whole component to the end, and you're going to do like use query and you're going to have a loading state is true. So you now have one tree, which is like loading is true. And here's what the UI is. Then, in the callback, you call set state. And so React is going to re-render again. Now loading is false and you have data. So those were two different trees right there. And React just rendered one and committed it. It rendered the first one and it rendered it. So it got the virtual representation of the component tree and it committed it to the screen immediately because there's nothing else for it to do. Right.
Well, they're two different trees, but they happen in a line. They're not happening.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The first time you render the component, use query, loading is true. React says, okay, there it is. I got my first tree, first state of the app. I'm going to render it and commit it. It's like those are the same thing. There is only rendering only meant, actually resolving the component and committing it to the screen. And then the callback happens. You call set state and it does it again. So that was like time t equals 1, you get this. And then time t equals 2, you get this. With Suspense, React can hit a promise that is thrown, catch it, and basically keep around the old version of the UI. And in the meantime, be trying to render the new one. Hits the promise, gets halfway through, waits for the promise to be resolved. But at that point, you render your Suspense fallback, right? But you kind of have this old version of the UI, and you have this like fallback spinner rendering. And now the promise comes back and you can render the new one. But the thing is, in between those two, like the rest of the app needs to be responsive because you're going from like T1 to Tn. And in the middle of it, you can be clicking other buttons. You can be hitting back button. New data could be coming in from the server. And so I guess I'm not 100% sure if the Suspense part is critical to this, but the basic idea is that as all these things are happening, like React can decide when it needs to actually paint and commit one of those trees to the screen.
Yeah, I think this does fall under Suspense. I think this is like the transition part, but I think it does fall under the Suspense umbrella. Keeping the UI reactive, I think, is a really important point where like you can be loading data, showing the old data, and you still want to be able to like, say it's a list of comments. You still want to be able to like interact with those comments while the data is
like
loading.
Expand and contrast them.
Yeah.
So, right, this was kind of the example that we had talked about that kind of made some of it click, right? Let's say you have like a list from the server and of like posts, and you see all their titles, and then you can click to expand and contrast, collapse it. So you have something like is expanded for by each one of these components, right? Then you click a button that's like refetch. If you wrote this today, this is what it was. Let's say you write this button, on click equals refetch. You have a function refetch that's going to do fetch posts dot then set post to the new post, right?
Mhm.
So you do that. And then while the network is pending, you're like interacting with these things. Maybe you go to another route. So now your app's going to break because the request is going to come back and you're going to call set state on post, but you've left that tree.
Yeah, but you can deal with that with like a is mounted effect.
You can, but the point is that you have to deal with that complexity yourself, and you can see how it's like it's a very ad hoc, like bubblegum way to solve this. You're not really thinking about your app in these different states anymore. You're concerning yourself with the transition, whereas you really want to be able to describe. It's like declarative rendering. You want to be able to describe what happens if this component is not ready, right, to render. Because as soon as you add anything async, like a network request, when the thing comes back, your app could be in any one of n different states. Suspense, by letting you throw a promise, lets you avoid that. That's what it does, because you don't have to actually you're bailing out, and so you're not like trying to catch all these pieces. So that's why. Because originally React has to render the whole function. Now it can stop. This is the other point, right? About suspense, which is so cool, and the mechanism for throwing promises. So today, if you write a refetch function, you call refetch.then set state. Where is the app when you call set state? You don't know. If you left the route, the component may be unmounted, and you're going to get the problem of trying to call set state on an unmounted component, right? Promises are push-based. So when you write that code and you say fetch.then set state, React has lost control of the ability to manage and orchestrate your UI, because that callback is going to get run. It's on the event loop. It's going to happen. And so it's going to, that's it. What if React could say, oh, we're actually not on this page anymore. We don't care about this anymore. It can't do that because promises are push based, and it's just going to run as soon as it gets done. So the cool thing about throwing a promise is that if you think about what React's able to do, it can run your component halfway through, catch the thrown promise, and then it can decide, it can get the resolution, right? The promise will still resolve, and it'll still call callback. And this is where the stable cache comes in, right? So the cache for these things lives outside of React. And when the promise resolves and it updates the cache, now React over here can say, okay, do I want to try to render this component again? And if I do, I'm going to read the value from the cache. So now you've gone from a push-based model to a pull-based model. React can decide when and how to render and re-render your components. With the cache, it lets you turn async components into a sync mental model. And React is always able to ask the caches for the values synchronously as it's attempting to render, and making all these different component trees at different representations of time and deciding how and when to render them. So that's why Suspense is like, we sometimes think about the boundary and the fallback UI. It's really this mechanism of throwing a promise, because now anytime your component in a sync world, we never have this problem, right? If everything was synchronous, when you write tic-tac-toe, in React, you don't have any of these problems, because there's no step in that game that is going to lead to two possible potentialities at some future point in time. It's synchronous. Mm-hmm. So with synchronous UI, you don't have this problem at all. And if you imagine everything that is asynchronous, if you force it to be sync, you'd also avoid this problem. So if you clicked refetch and you blocked the thread until the post came back, you wouldn't have any of this complexity, because you would know exactly what the state of your app is in when those posts come back, because nothing else has happened. Just like you know what the state of the app is at the end of a function when the beginning of a function runs, because that's the only thing that's happening. There's one thread and it's running from top to bottom. It's very easy to understand synchronous code on one thread, because you're literally following a series of steps from beginning to end. So we never get confused about that. There's no equivalent of calling set on an unmounted component in synchronous code anywhere, because it all just runs top to bottom, right? There's nothing that happens outside of it. It's only when you introduce asynchronicity that this happens. So now imagine every time, right? So because your refetch is asynchronous, that's where all these bugs come in. You call a set state, but you don't know what the state of the app is going to be when that code runs. What if you did? What if you could throw it, the promise, every time that is async you throw? And so instead, once you make it actually past that, it's because you've gotten that eventual value from a cache somewhere, but now you're just looking at it like a synchronous function. I mean, it's literally turning async UI into synchronous UI. Like you have, that's effectively what all this is doing.
It's not, I know what you're saying when you say, imagine you knew the state of the app. It's like technically correct, but I think there's even there's a better way to say this where it's the app can only be in one state.
Yes, exactly.
The app, it's in a consistent
it's impossible.
State. Like it is.
Yeah. It's forcing you to have all these trees be consistent. You can't call set state. You can't call. Think about it. It's like let posts equals use query posts, and then you call set state posts, and it's like, well, what if you called set state posts when it's unmounted? Well, it would never be there because it literally can't, because React is going to render it. And if it is, and any async value is in the cache, it's going to render it synchronously there. And if not, it's not going to render it.
It's literally, it's turning async code into sync code. It's unbelievable. Because it's
crazy.
You get done with async code. I'm making air quotes here.
Right.
And then you have code after, but if that code after is running, then you can just read it as if you're reading a synchronous function.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. And then it's crazy. So it's like you want to look at your function that's like use query posts. It's like doing some work and then you hit like a hook that suspends, right? So you do some work, use query posts, let post equals use query posts, and then you return it. If you see through the matrix, you have two functions that you just wrote. One is you do some work and then you're like, I'm not ready, just stop and I'm done. And that's it. We can look at that whole component. This is what's going to happen when we render this component when we don't have the post. How do I get the post? Don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. But you as an app developer, you're looking at this thing and you're like, oh, that's fine. We get halfway down, we don't have the post, and so that's the end of the function, and that's it. There's no defensive code. There's no what happens if I get down here and this value is one thing or another. It's literally only always one value.
Do I use two fetches in my component? It's do I have A, not B? Do I have A and B? Is A loading? Is B loading? No, I know if I made those two fetches and I'm below that, it's sync code and I have A and B.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then the next one is just right. Is you just go there, you have it, and then you're there. So it's crazy, man. And it's like there's this master plan that's related to all the work that's been going on. And it's not even just the data fetching suspense stuff is part of it. But it's really this, there's some crazy stuff in these threads and these conversations about gestures and animations. You start thinking about animations being async, you render a page from one page to the next. And it's it takes time. Basically anything that takes time is why UI is hard, because you want UI to be, think about the code we write. This is why functions Rails controller methods are so easy to understand. You go down. This thing is taking time. It's querying a database, but you don't care. You either get it or you don't. You either get the database query or you don't. You don't think what is the state of my app going to be when this next line of Ruby code runs. You never think about that.
Do I have the database? Is it back? No. Yeah, of course. I don't think about that. If I write an SQL statement on the very next line, I have all the data that I just queried.
Exactly. So this is literally
so
being
much
right.
Easier.
It's so much easier. And in Ruby on the server, let's say, you don't care about what happens in between when you first open the connection to database and when you read the results. The time in between that, you're not having to do anything else. You want that to happen as fast as possible, and there's nothing that you need to do in the meantime. But in UI, you can't do that. If you clicked refetch and you just stopped the world while it was waiting for that response, obviously you can't do that. And so that's why it's so hard. That's why, it's like, it's interesting because it's like, does Ruby code, like Rails code, have asynchronous calls? In the sense that they take time. Async is like, it's more about like what's relevant. Exactly. It's like, is the time in between action A and action B important, and do you want to handle what happens then? And basically in UI, like at a very fundamental level, you do. You never want it to not be responsive no matter what's happening. So yeah, it's like being able to write Rails controller code, but still having a very simple, expressive way to say what should happen if you're ever in between. So that's like where the suspense thing happens, like the fallback boundary. So you say like, I want to refetch the posts. This thing's not ready over here. And now I can just say, oh, in this other state of the world, here's exactly how I want to paint my thing. But I'm still in like a sync mindset the entire time. There's never like part of my component coming back and, set state on, you know what I mean? It's like, it takes care of all that stuff.
This conversation, like, I think, when I was thinking about suspense before, I was worried that like, I'm going to have these like, okay, so let me back up a little. Right now in all my components, I do a query and I get like data loading and error. And then when my component returns, it's basically some, ternary based on those. When I've been thinking about moving to suspense, it's always felt like, okay, this is going to be weird. Like I'm going to be writing these async hooks, but there's not going to be like any async code, any loading code, anything like that. So it's always felt like it's just going to feel weird writing async code, knowing that the implementation is async, but then not seeing async await or any sort of loading state in my components. And it's like, is this going to feel like I'm just like writing in another language? Like just writing like some like one-off like Frankenstein.
Weird DSL thing.
Yeah.
Like coding in JavaScript.
Yeah. But then now, like based off everything you just said, I don't feel that way because it's like, no, you're just going to think you're writing sync code and you're just going to think you have data. You don't have to ever think about loading. Like you just think you just have data. If you use query and the next line is console.log data, the data is guaranteed to be there.
Yeah.
So that's, it's interesting.
Yeah. It's crazy. And then it's like, well, if and it's a great point, right? Because it's like async await, like if you're writing a function and you write await fetch posts, and then the next line you say, set posts, like from a JavaScript language perspective, how can you express what you want to happen between those two lines of code? You can't. Like there's no way to do it. It's how it's designed. So you don't really get to there's like a world there. There's like all these different slices of the app that's happening while those two steps of code are like being awaited or whatever. But you've lost like the ability to even like express what you want the app to be like. So instead, the throwing thing is a nice way to solve this, because then that coupled with the suspense boundaries, it's like the suspense boundaries are natural seams, because when you add asynchronous work to your app and you don't want to lock the UI, naturally the question comes, okay, well, what do you want the UI to be like when different parts of your component tree aren't ready to render? And how do you want the UI to resolve when we do finish this? And the suspense boundaries are just like natural seams to do that. And they're made in a way that's like, oh, actually, there's a really natural way to do this. Like if I have a child that's not ready, I'm going to get to decide what to show. And then it could just all work, and it doesn't matter how many children suspend or how long they do. You have control at you can take that down, or you can be as granular or as coarse as you want as you're answering this question, which is what to do with my UI when components suspend. But you're able to like do it thinking again, like in these like synchronous slices of your app. And, it's really crazy. This is from this, I'll link this, the suspense. There's this SSR architecture thread, but it was saying that, the key part. So SSR and React, Server fetch the data, hydrate, blah, blah, blah. Key part is that each step had to finish for the entire app at once before the next step could start. React 18 lets you use Suspense to break down your app into smaller independent units, which will go through these steps independently. So there's just like, it has so many implications. Like this is talking about SSR and React.lazy, but it's actually the same issues with like fetching data on the client. And basically this ability, the boundaries that you create so that you can have consistent trees of your app, even if async things are happening, is what lets React in parallel create multiple versions of your tree, each of which are absolutely consistent. And you're never going to like be trying to ad hoc account for, promises resolving and screwing you up. And then it can do all this cool stuff like show certain things if there's a slow network, show things if there's a slow CPU, do things on the server with them, stream parts of it before other parts. Basically, all of these benefits come out of this crazy architecture.
It's funny you're mentioning all these, but all I can think about is not having to juggle loading and data.
And set state.
Yeah. So
never running is mounted ever again. Which, is that true? Like that seems crazy, right? I mean, the only reason you'd ever do is mounted is if it's async, right? That's literally the only.
Yeah, because it could have changed. It could have changed since I run the next line. I would have to think more about it, but I mean, again, you definitely convinced. My reaction when you were describing this was like, oh, you just use is mounted. But then like, no, now I have to literally track the world. And it's like, no, I'm like describing the transition. This thing is no longer mounted.
Totally.
And that sucks. We know that sucks because we know that declarative rendering has just been so helpful over the years. So
right. Right, exactly. If is open, then close. No, you just want to set the state. Yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
Really cool.
There's like so many layers to this.
I know.
But and I've already been thinking about it like all week. And like this really just scratches the surface.
Well,
there's like
I was going to say, like, I think when we started this, we've been doing this for like 3 weeks now, and it's mainly been you driving, but we've been discussing this for like 3 weeks. And it was this idea that Suspense was kind of just this one big suspense thing. And then I think now we're realizing like, okay, so there's async rendering and how do you manage when to like abort and continue?
Right.
So that's where like the promises come in. That's where the control flow stuff. There's like fallbacks, which, you described are the seams. And then there's this idea of transitioning and being able to have these parallel trees. Right.
So there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, the animation one was cool because you have like, you're swiping a page or something and it's like a beginning and end state. But then you look at like iOS and how everything's basically interruptible. You're opening an app and you can slow it down and swipe it back. You can switch and everything is always responsive. This is like modern iOS is like the pinnacle of responsive UI where no matter what you're doing at the OS level, everything is going to react. Whether you just lost Wi-Fi, whether state of the device is changing over here, you're still gonna be able to change the volume. Again, the app is doing work. You can switch to another app. Everything's fluid about it. The WWDC conference talked about that a couple of years ago when they first released like the new app switcher and everything. And it's like interruptibility basically requires this notion of the consistent trees over time. Because if you click a link and you start transitioning, what happens if you cancel it? You need to know. You need to have the old state of the world. You need to have all these potential states of the world, right?
Or you are literally like tracking state and it's a nightmare.
Exactly.
And you never get anything done because
exactly. Like every time we try to do like a navigation stack or whatever to deal with this and like keep copies of things, this is basically like React is going to be able to offload all this stuff because as long as you can fulfill the contract and like declare all of your stuff in the way you're supposed to, it's like going to open up a lot of doors.
Given X state, I get these pixels on the screen, and if I change things, I have a new state, but I can still go back to my old state.
Just think about like you're opening a new route and you start rendering this tree of components that does all this stuff and then you cancel it. React can literally throw away all the work because it just throws it away. You could have a million promises kick off. You could have crazy animations kick off that are starting. All that stuff, it could literally just throw it away because it actually is, again, it's pull based now rather than push based. Instead of like you click a link and then now here's all this work that you push onto React and it's done when I say it's done because I have 3.thens or whatever, right? React is like pulling. It's like the user clicked a link. Okay, now React's going to ask your code, what is the tree? What's the new tree? And it's part of it is ready. Okay, this part's not. So here's like the first frame with the suspense fallback. I'm going to keep asking for the latest version of the tree as these promises resolve until I get something that I feel is good to render. Or if something happens, I'm actually done with this and I don't have to pull this anymore.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's kind of a cool way to think about it. And it kind of helps understand how the being able to abort halfway through a component flips the whole thing, lets React ask your app what it needs when it needs it. And then it's like back in the driver's seat, right? And it just gets to like all this defensive code you find yourself writing. I think a lot of it's going to go away.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm super exciting. Abort. I wonder if abort, I mean, I know abort is like how we think about this, but I wonder if that's like the wrong way to describe it. I wonder if it's like should continue. You know what I'm saying? Like it's
like it can just discard it. It's interruptible. Like
interruptible, where it's like I hit this promise. Okay, you threw a promise, it resolved, but I'm not going to run the rest of that tree anymore because you've moved on to
it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally like a abort controller, right? A abort controller with a fetch lets you say that this is no longer relevant. Now, the browser still sent the request. No, but listen, this is a good thing because it's like the browser sends the request. You can't stop that, and you can't stop the response from coming back because that's beyond the boundary there. But if you have an abort controller that you use and you call it, the rest of the code, I think it's just like discarded. It doesn't run anymore. It's just like discarded. So again, you've gone to like this place. So today you have to manually do that. With React 18, it's basically doing that for you. And the boundaries of when it could potentially abort if the rest of the code is no longer relevant is exactly the parts of your components to suspend. That's the whole point.
Yeah. Abort controller's hard for me with this because I'm still the one that's aborting. Like there's
no, I know, but that's the point. I'm using an analogy. I'm saying abort controller is a way that you can tell you don't have to think defensively anymore, and you can just say this is no longer relevant, and that way it's just gone. It's like you're just discarding the code, you know, and throwing a promise to suspend your React component is the same thing. Now that React can do that. It's just giving it a stopping point, you know. It's giving it a checkway point and saying, here's some async work. You know, things are about to get hairy, or you know, it's like okay. I'm going to give you a component that returns static JSX. Boom. Like one frame, it's done. I can use this. You know, React's like, I can use this right now. You know, you give it something that has an async hook or does some async work. React's going to get there and say, all right, well,
let me know when you're done. And I'll come, if I'm still interested, I'll come back and render you.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to put you right here, let you do your thing. Meanwhile, I'm going to go over here, keep responding to all the event handlers, keep responding to new data. Everything in the tree is consistent. You get a notification. React gets a little notification bell. This component's ready. And then it can say, oh, is it still relevant? If so, one frame, what you got? If you can give me something, maybe I'll use it. If I hit another place where I suspend, all right, keep doing your work. Let me know when you're ready. It's really cool.
I'm so excited. I know
it's crazy.
Use this all right now.
Yeah. So just to wrap this up, why doesn't this all work today, and why are some of the data fetching related stuff still in research and development? When I was experimenting with Suspense, I realized what I was doing kind of naively was wrong, which was like throwing a new promise in render. And this goes back to the very beginning of this conversation, which is about identity. I was throwing a new promise in render and then resolving it the promise has to be stable. So all of this stuff has to do with, again, like these consistent trees and like stability and knowing like, oh, what I have here is the same as this next one. I'm trying to render you again and see if you're here. I need the same pointer to see if that thing is ready. So with Suspense, like you have to throw a stable object. So if you have your post component, it needs to have a cache object that's like, let's say in module scope, and then you throw like cache dot fetching promise, and you throw that every time until it's ready. It's the same one though, because like React's like needs to use the resolve function, right? It's going to dot then it to know when it's ready. It's like in a queue somewhere, and it's going to dot then it, so it has to be the same one. So that's one part. You can't just throw different promises over and over again.
Or just imagine every time you threw a new promise, every time React, it would resolve. React would go to render you, and you'd throw a brand new promise. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was like the first thing that I ran into when I did this. But even if you can do it in a way that doesn't happen, if you have like status variable that's in module scope and stable, but like your promise is new, it's still violating the contract or whatever. The thing is, how do you let's say that cache gets stale, the value that you read from it. So you throw the promise, it resolves, you set it on the cache. Now you want to invalidate the cache. And this is basically the part that's still kind of under R&D from the perspective of the use case of data fetching. Because how do you do that? Your instinct might be to like delete the key. Let's say cache is just an object and it has like posts. You want to delete the key, but like how do you do that? The cache by definition has to live outside of React state because it needs to be stable across re-renders. So you can't call set state and trigger. How do you trigger a re-render?
Well, even if you could, like if you have the cache and you delete the key, now our parallel trees are reading from the same cache, like the quote unquote same cache. And so your app is no longer consistent because you no longer have a consistent render because you just you rug pulled the cache out from underneath it.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. So, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And this is this is where the data fetching, this is my understanding is why it doesn't work with the data fetching. Because when you are doing data fetching, there's probably going to be a lot of instances where you do need to invalidate the cache.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. And even refetch it, right? It's just stale. I mean, it's data. It's a tweet as of 10 seconds ago. I need to update it. So how do you update it? You know, how do you say that the old version is how do you update it? How would you know if like React is pull based now? It's going to try to read the thing again. How does it know if it's stale or not? Well, I guess you could say if it's been 10 seconds or something. I'm not exactly sure, but I think what you said before made a lot of sense. Anyways, the point is, I think what you said before, you said it best. And there's a cache object that is going to be part of React. Again, this is all like just like future experimental alpha stuff. But the idea is there's going to be a cache object that you can use that you import from React that's more deeply integrated with React. So when you need to invalidate the cache for certain things that have been read, now React can know it's time to re-render. And so that's how you would trigger re-render after like, but you can kind of see how it would work, right? Because again, in this future world where you have all these different async things that are suspending your app, and React is like, it's not even just async. Now it's like the use transition stuff. Use transition is another way to create a new tree of your app that is consistent and can be, again, like, do you show a faded out thing while the CPU is your CPU bound, right? So you need two trees to be able to do that. And so the cache needs to be more tightly bound up with React so that you can invalidate it. But again, like you said, you still have the stale version of it because you need both those trees as the async work is happening for exactly the same reason. So that's why. You need to be able to basically invalidate a cache without like deleting the key. You can't lose that last state. You need to be able to hold on to those states. And so there's going to be some API for that. But until that whole thing is ready, even libraries like SWR can't do it 100% correctly with React 18.
Interesting.
Because
So
they're going to be doing something like deleting the key and then setting state, but like that's just not the right. It's you know what I'm saying. It doesn't work because it's just not the paradigm. It's like it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be really hard to write this yourself. Like you're just keeping around a bunch of caches and trying to relate them to different renders.
Exactly.
Because
that's what we were talking about.
If you cancel this, I might actually need to go back to that render from 5 seconds ago.
Exactly. You're refetching it. You deleted the cache key to trigger a re-render, but now you cancel it or something else happens and now you don't have the data anymore. Someone clicks like remove post or something like that. It's just all screwed up. Like your tree is inconsistent. That's why all of these things, these guarantee you have these consistent trees, which is such a big piece of this puzzle. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff, man. Anyways, I think in my personal experiment right now, because I did hit a bug, the whole thing was me trying to get the dang fallback spinner to animate out on my app. And I think it's just not ready to do it yet. I think I'm going to go back to React 17 and just use Suspense via one of the libraries, data fetching libraries, which is, even though it's not like ready for 18, I guess I'll just wait and see what they do. But for now, I'll be able to use it, but probably not animate it out.
Gotcha.
But I really loved how it has cleaned up my code already. Because I already have removed a ton of defensive code, and I've been able to just co-locate the queries with my tree, like my leaf components and everything like that. So it's pretty wild, man. It really is almost like a whole new. I mean, it's still React, obviously, but there's a lot of new stuff here. I mean, it's almost like a new paradigm.
Dude, it is. I mean, it's async code that reads like it's sync.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's like how to express async UI with sync code. Yeah.
It's so funny that I think when we started this podcast Suspense journey, it was like, oh, it's a great tool for handling multiple loading spinners into one. And now we're like, listen, there's parallel trees.
Yeah, exactly. Now we're like the guy with like, he's got like the strings on. He's like, totally deep down the rabbit hole.
Love it.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome though. Yeah. And then it's like unlocks all this streaming stuff. I'm going to put together some of these links and maybe we'll even read some of them on a future episode. But oh my gosh, this stuff is crazy. It's really, really cool.
Those episodes where we used to do read the thing and then discuss it, those were always popular. So maybe we should, we should do something like that. That would be good.
Totally. Yeah, this built-in suspense cache right here. Remember we were looking at the cache, and anyways, it's really cool.
Good times.
All right, man. Well, that was maybe not the most practical episode of Front End First, but hope you enjoyed it. My name's Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And we always forget to introduce ourselves at the beginning of the show. And sometimes we get called out for it. So there you go. I'm going to go home and seamless something and watch some TV and go to sleep. And I can't wait. So I hope you all enjoyed that. And we will see you next week.
Nice. See ya.
Bye.